Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Guillaume Dumas. He's an associate professor at the University of Montreal and a principal investigator at the CHU Sainte-Justine Research Centre. His work focuses on social interaction and interbrain synchronization, bringing together neuroscience, developmental psychology, and dynamical systems to study how real-time interaction shapes brain activity. What's especially interesting about this work is that we're used to thinking of cognition as something that happens inside individual brains. Yet this research invites us to consider what might change when we treat interaction itself as part of the cognitive process. Some of his earlier work helped lay the groundwork for what's often been called two-person or interaction-based neuroscience, using techniques like hyperscanning to study live social exchange. I have linked several of his key publications in the description below for those who want to explore the work further. Doctor, before we get into your research, how did you originally find your way into neuroscience?
So originally, I was more heading towards astrophysics and cosmology, and I was doing a lot of volunteering for student unions and student associations, and I ended up representing the students at the board of my engineering school. And at that board, they were the director of École Normale Supérieure, a leading school in research in France. And he advised me to look into cognitive science, because he knew that I was more into the physics, astrophysics, and so on. He said you seems like a social person, and astrophysics and so on is fascinating, but you may be isolated. And cognitive science going to be something that's going to be at the big interface with society. And since I was motivated by astrophysics and cosmology originally for more metaphysical questions and big questioning, and cognitive science was also a big discovery, and I dive into it immediately, and very quickly I went to cognitive science master after my engineering school, and neuroscience was part of the curriculum and happened to be really the most fascinating part of all that. Yeah, maybe because coming from physics, the brain appeared as a very fascinating, complex system, and connecting deep metaphysical question with tangible questions that can be addressed through scientific method was very appealing. Yeah.
Once you started integrating yourself into neuroscience, did you feel there were other fields or perspectives that were important for understanding cognition beyond looking at the brain itself?
Yeah, so, physics by training appeared like a good guiding field in terms of pragmatic use of mathematical formalism to explain reality. And so I didn't add difficulty to go towards more a computational approach of neuroscience with my physics background and engineering background. Then the motivation were also associated with philosophy. So to me, there's a strong grounding in all inquiry into the conceptual and historical concepts of the field to be able to address properly the question and not repeat the same errors from the past. So history of science, even by extent, not only philosophy, but philosophy and history of science to me have been like super important, not as a practitioner, but more as a reader at first. And now I'm starting to do a bit of philosophy, but I'm not from a training philosopher, so I take time to do it carefully.
As you were preparing to set up your experiment behind the 2010 publication, what was the core question you were ultimately trying to answer, or what assumption were you hoping to challenge?
So like the original paper came originally from Francisco Varela. Like I was in the former lab of Francisco Varela. He was already passed away, but that's reading his book called Invitation to Cognitive Science that actually convinced me to go really into cognitive science. And when I realized that his former lab was in Paris, I immediately went there. And it appeared that a lot of the people who work with him, especially the students, left because despite being widely recognized internationally, his ideas were still very controversial. And now it's interesting to see how, for instance, embodiment or altered state of consciousness are so normalized academically, while in fact it was not the case when Varela was working in Paris. And he had like even political pressure to drop like his work, for instance, on meditation and so on, because it was not really well seen by the more like secular and conservative French system. And so basically a lot of the people who were really continuing to work on those lines went away. And so when I arrived in the lab, there were a lot the old timers that were friends with him, and one of the last projects that they wanted to do couldn't work out because he passed away very tragically from cancer, very young. But the idea was still floating in the air, and it was about recording multiple brains simultaneously. But from a technological standpoint, the tools were not clear. And so with the background from engineering, I was bringing also the technological aspect to be able to do that. So I was an enabler as a master student to build the stuff. And beyond the technical enablement that I brought, the questions became partially reconstructed from what we understood that was the inquiry initially planned with Varela, but also in collaboration with other scientists, including, for instance, Scott Kelso, with whom I did my postdoc later. And they had like a Human Frontiers project with Varela on also those questions of interpersonal relationship and so on. And I guess it took me a lot of time to really mature the deep questioning behind all that. And we just published last week the summary of the philosophical inquiry under the name Now is the Time. And it's about like generative neurophenomenology and how cognition and consciousness may be like more social than solipsistic. And how, as humans, we are kind of a sandwich between our biological immanence and this social, cultural transcendence. And so like we are the interface between those two things. And Varela, working with Maturana in the past, was really strongly in the systems biology with autopoiesis and trying to understand how biology, while being material, is not necessarily reductionist to think about biology as a material thing, and leaving space for dynamics and how systems can forge their own meaning by interacting with the environment. So that's more like the inactive approach that he developed later on. And ultimately, like the last part of his life and what I kind of caught up after is neurophenomenology and how to bridge the gap between the first person experience and the subjective experience with the third person experience and the objective reality. And neuroscience and physiology in general become this objective side of the neurophenomenology, while the phenomenology and the subjectivity is the first person. And the last development with generative neurophenomenology is about bringing the others, and the fact that even for Husserl at his end of life, Husserl tried to move away from a static phenomenology, trying to capture consciousness as a snapshot, as more like a generative and dynamic phenomenology where you need to take into account the historicity and the relationship with others. And so ultimately this interbrain synchronization and this paper in 2010 was the start of bringing that, operationalizing this kind of approach of cognition and consciousness.
Now let's get into the publication, Interbrain Synchronization During Social Interaction. For a general audience, could you walk us through how you approached this experiment? How did you set it up? What methods did you use? And why were those choices important for observing real-time social interaction?
Sure. So the 2010 paper was also a tales of interdisciplinarity with like two labs meeting at the interface. One lab was the former lab of Varela, I already spoke about, but the other lab was the lab of Jacqueline Nadel, who was a developmental psychology lab. And Jacqueline has been like a pioneer in studying how relationship between babies and parents are also constitutive. And they already did what I called behavioral hyperscanning by recording mother-infant interaction. So like in a sense, compared to cognitive psychology, developmental psychology has been more concerned about the intersubjective dimension of cognition and how interaction with others is more constituted than just a task that we do. And so this study was kind of the encounter between those two cultures. The developmental psychologists who have been studied this dual video system for looking at interaction between infant and parents, and the neurodynamicists who have been studying social interaction just from the outside as more like a task than really bringing the interaction in the lab. And so like the neurodynamicists have a deep understanding of what synchronization is within the brain, while the developmental psychologists have a deep understanding of synchronization between people. And the deal was to bring those things together conceptually. And so there were like initially a lot of discussion about what synchronization mean, what is this functional meaning, from a neural perspective, from a behavioral perspective, from a social perspective. And the hyperscanning system was a way to bridge these two worlds in a sense, because we had like two people having a social interaction, spontaneous, so bring for real in the lab this ecological setting. And by recording two brains, we were able to link the synchronization of behavior with the synchronization of neural activity. And even if it's initially more like a correlate, it was extremely hard to publish. Like people were very, very critique about even the motivation of doing that kind of things. Like so, it was awful as a PhD student because I had to submit maybe more than 14 times, I think. And with the reviewer even not believing the data themselves. So it was very, very hard. And ultimately, like the design was pretty transparent and clear. We recorded people simultaneously doing different tasks, and we showed that we replicate known intra-brain correlates. There were no questioning too much about the quality of the data itself. It was really like the novelty of bringing markers between brains instead of within brains that was difficult to make the cut at the editorial and reviewer barrier.
For listeners who may not be familiar with the term hyperscanning, could you briefly explain what it is and why it represented a step forward for studying real-time social interaction?
Sure. So sorry, maybe I was not clear enough. Hyperscanning is basically to record multiple brains simultaneously, which is pretty straightforward when you think about it, but not straightforward technically initially. Now there are like companies who build imaging systems that provide you the way to do it off the box. But at that time, we had to tinker a lot with engineering and so on. And I mean, like, still those days, like people are questioning the scientific even necessity to record two brains simultaneously, assuming that just recording one brain is enough to understand what's going on in the brain during social interaction. But the point is coming from physics. By recording two brains, you may be able to measure nonlinear phenomena such as resonance that cannot be captured with one system only. You need to have two systems at least to capture resonance. And so first, there were like a first phase during 2010 to 2020, I would guess. So during 10 years, it was more about measuring those interbrain synchronization in different contexts, trying to show not only that it replicates, but that it also makes sense regarding the earlier literature on single brain recordings. And then also potentially do also clarification about what does it mean functionally. And is it like a unitary phenomenon, or is it the reflection of multiple factors simultaneously? And spoiler alert, it is. Or like measuring so many factors simultaneously that having proper experimental design is necessary. Like you're measuring simultaneously the similarity between two systems, but also the exchange of information between those systems. And so starting late 2010 to 2020, people started also to do stimulation. And when it started to be validated as a correlate, and people started to say like, well, okay, it's a correlate, but well, maybe it's just an epiphenomenon. It's not that interesting. We started to show that first, it can be still leveraged for like biomarker or potentially arguing and helping in deciphering theories by having a robust objective marker of interpersonal relationship. But more than that, like people started by having stimulation to show that it may be more than just a correlate and could have actually a functional meaning and a downward causation on social behavior. And so it has been like done initially in 2017 with the team of Giacomo Novembre. We have to wait 2021 with someone working on mice to show it on mice as well. And people really started to listen in a sense when it's done with cellular recordings in mice and optogenetics. And my lab recently also published proof that if you force synchronization, that may have downstream consequences on social behavior. And so like it moves from initially like this is not possible to that's maybe a correlate, but an epiphenomenon to maybe it has actually a functional and mechanistic role. And now in the last 6 months, typically a team of colleagues in UCLA by Weijie Hong published in Nature and Science recordings in mice showing how those interbrain relationship may play a role in having a shared neural space for cooperation, and align with also what we are doing in the lab, showing that this same kind of shared neural space appear in neural agent, artificial neural agent. And so now there's like a lot of effort to even translate those knowledge from social neuroscience to psychiatry and to AI. So yeah, in 15 years, a lot of stuff happened in that space.
I notice that your work has sometimes been discussed in terms of shared minds, or what sometimes is described as collective consciousness. From your perspective, are those interpretations an overreach, or do you think they might be hinting towards something about real social interaction that we just don't know yet how to formally describe or confirm?
Yeah, so like this first, to me, it's a question that needs to be asked. And we have a whole piece that's going to come out soon on collective consciousness as a test for theories of individual consciousness as well, where we try to troll, in quote, classical theories of consciousness by saying like, actually, a lot of people put the collective consciousness as a marginal and completely non-scientific idea, echoing like some crazy stuff that had been said on that space in the past. But beyond this classical emotional reaction, if you go into a philosophical questioning of why collective consciousness is so repulsive for some people, there is no clear-cut answer that doesn't apply to individual consciousness theories, except the fact that there is a sort of morphological prejudice that we are able to relate to individual consciousness, but collective consciousness is like a morphological bias where we can't really understand it. And there are like very interesting philosophers like, for instance, Eric Schitzgebel, who argue with different approach how even a pure reductionist perspective on consciousness will, if you put it at the extreme, will lead to the consciousness of a state. So like there's a famous paper by Eric Schitzgebel called like, if reductionist is true, then the United States are conscious. That kind of take by absurdum the fact that actually it's not an easy question. And my point is not saying that collective consciousness exists, but we need to have a clear definition of individual consciousness that would make it falsifiable to say that it doesn't, which right now is not really clear. And in this chapter with Nathalie Castell, who's a PhD with me in the lab, we even take like a sort of yes/no decision tree. Was saying like, okay, but what if you think consciousness is that based on, for instance, global neural workspace theory, or if it's not that with attention schema theory. So we take all the theories and end up saying like, well, actually, the postulate mechanism for this theory of consciousness could totally apply to collective systems as well. And so we have this morphological prejudice that we discuss in this chapter, saying like, well, maybe collective consciousness is just like not really intuitive to conceptualize as a human because that's not how we work. But that's not because it's not easily captured by our intuition that it does not exist. And we need to have a clear inquiry about those. And we also argue in the chapter that actually collective intelligence went through that too. Like now it's not questioned anymore. Like people understand that there is a collective intelligence and there are like whole institution working on that, while it used to be also like a fringe kind of topic. And so to me, like collective consciousness may become like more legitimate topic in the future. Yeah. But the big question is how to study something that is hard to assess because we are not necessarily able to experience the phenomenology of a collective. So there's a big challenge out there, but it's similar challenge to consciousness of machines, for instance, because we won't experience either consciousness in AI or artificial agent. So it's something that we want to study and assess, but we don't have access directly.
I noticed you're doing some work in the field of AI. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, well, there are many line of work in the lab associated with AI, but for the sake of this topic and our discussion, I guess like the most important is the social neuro AI part of the lab, which is trying to continue the inspiration that started with deep learning and the work of people like Yoshua Bengio here at Mila in Quebec, to try to take inductive biases from our understanding of how the brain works and apply those inductive biases to artificial systems. And so deep learning and also other examples like network, reinforcement learning in some extent were deeply inspired by cognitive systems in biology. And the neuro AI field now is trying to have this virtuous cycle between neuroscience and artificial intelligence, potentially going both directions, like having AI to help understand the brain, but also through understanding better the brain, make better artificial agent. And in the lab, we have a very specific take on that. So we wrote like a roadmap a couple of years ago called Social Neuro AI. Is social interaction the black matter of AI in a sense, and the dark matter of AI, and the axis that we envision is that we have this bio-inspired aspect. So like actually most advanced intelligent beings are social and specifically humans. So even if we continue this axis of biology inspiration for AI, the social dimension becomes like pregnant in a sense, very important. And on top, like our research through hyperscanning and other research in developmental psychology and so on show that actually it's through social learning also that we are developing our higher cognitive ability. So we are not feral agents. We have society that educate us and cultured us. And so understanding sociality may be important if we want to uncultured AI agent to be like socially compatible with us. So that's first axis. The second axis is more like about embodiment. So like the fact that most of the artificial agent until recently were very abstract and even chatbots are still text-based, but now there's like a awareness into how robotics and embodied agents are of different nature, because they have like they are exploring the world and they are actor in the world on top of learning from the world. And so this is the second axis, more like this social embodiment of agents and how to move away from chatbot and integrate like virtual avatars, for instance, in virtual environment that already have a sense of space, but virtual, to at the external limit, humanoids and robots that actually are embodied truly in the environment. And the third axis of the lab is about dynamics, and it feels for a lot of people that is disconnected from the sociality aspect, but actually it isn't, in a sense that from a both neuroscience perspective and phenomenological perspective also, going back to Husserl and what we discussed early on generative neurophenology, the sense of time and the sense of others is intimately linked. And from a neuroscience perspective, the perception of time is also intimately linked with the apparatus that allow us to interact with other people. And so that's kind of the reverse engineering of the social brain that we are trying to do also in the lab, and that converge on how dynamics is not like a mere detail, but maybe more critical for processing information and especially social information.
It seems like time would be the perfect place to combine both your interests in physics and biology. Understanding how the brain interprets time and develops a sense of time, is that something that you're working on?
Yeah, so we have an upcoming piece on the temporal brain and the social brain and how those things intersect a lot, actually, and how the intrinsic neural timescales that we have are attuned to behavior and social behavior. And so time is a very important aspect of what we're doing through dynamics that we're studying. And I'm studying also dynamics in neural networks, for instance, dynamics of learning and stuff like that. And dynamical systems theory to me has always been like my ideal Lego brick formalism. I love dynamical systems because they are like extremely agnostic and very versatile as a tool. And cognitive systems and living systems are systems that are dynamics. Like you can't deny that. So you have to deal with that in a sense. But I would say like recently my physics part was especially aligned with big questionings regarding the importance of substrate for cognition, and the big debate happening between a pure functionalist approach of cognition and consciousness and a more biological, naturalistic approach, like Anil Seth, for instance, who defend like a role of the substrate beyond just like a mere implementation of an algorithm. And those are things that we are working at the lab using simulation in quantum computing and trying to play with exotic form of computing, thermodynamic computing, quantum computing, and thus trying to have examples of substrate-dependent computation to show that maybe we have been also ill influenced by the von Neumann architecture and the classical way of computing that separate the substrate from the function, which is extremely non-energetically optimal, because like by forcing your 0 and 1, you're fighting against nature. And now you have new forms of computing, like thermodynamic computing, that can follow Berkminster-Fuller expression, like don't fight forces, use them. And like in a way, don't fight physics, use physics to do the computation. And by having that from engineering perspective, it's already super fascinating to be allowed to do more energetically or more performant and fast computing using physics. But also, I think it's a very nice playground to question a bit our very dualistic functionalist take on cognition in the recent years. And so that's recently what connect the most with my earlier physics background and interest. Yeah.
As I was looking through your publications, I noticed you spent a considerable amount of time working on autism. Did that emerge as a separate interest for you, or does it feel like a natural extension of earlier questions about social interaction, coordination, and interbrain dynamics?
Yeah, it was totally linked to my early interest. And over the year, it make even more sense regarding also getting a non-normative and idiosyncratic account of social cognition, but a more like a general account. And right now in the lab, we have one of the largest projects in the lab is a Canadian health research project on autism in hyperscanning, and we are doing phenomenological interview of autistic individuals to understand also how their approach of others is different, but it's there. And so like instead of pathologizing it or denying it or seeing it as a defectious social ability, trying to more understand how much like this diversity of approach of togetherness and being with others can give us information about what it is in general, not for just neurotypical. And so autism to me has been like a guiding topic over the years, and also an inspiring one. And that's not a coincidence that my lab is in a child hospital, because to me it's also a way to try to connect back with society and give back to society to work on the medical domain, and trying to help, but understand, listen. And yeah, it has been extremely a source of meaning in my recent years of working.
If you could design an experiment today with no financial or technical constraints, what would you most want to understand about cognition and the human experience?
Well, I would do like a gigantic survey worldwide on cultural and diversity of phenomenology. And in the same way, there is like this big project on large cohorts to understand the diversity of biology, to also have like the same kind of inquiry, but for subjective experience, and try to understand this diversity of perspective and maybe normalize that diversity to the point like people get more empathy between each other to understand how the world can be seen so different ways. But from like a pure technological standpoint, and like all those exotic computing are also very exciting. I mean, like that's more like the nerd in me speaking. So, but there are like a lot of cool stuff to potentially try at the interface with solid state physics, and trying to leverage physics phenomenon to do computation. and in neuromorphic computing as well. So that could be also kind of stuff where I would be curious, for instance, I'm already doing that in some aspect, but trolling again the established theory of consciousness by implementing what they pretend to be the mechanism of consciousness, and still being in front of my laptop, not convinced it's conscious. So to what extent we can do that even with hardware and pushing the limits of what is claimed to be necessary for consciousness, and questioning it once it's done that maybe it's not making a big difference functionally in a sense. So maybe there's like some pieces missing to the theory.
In terms of the different camps in consciousness, do you lean more one way or another, or are you open to multiple frameworks at this point?
I'm more like a lumper than a splitter, epistemologically. So I tend to shamelessly take what is working in different theories and combine them together, not having like really emotional attachment to one more than another. And I think like we are so far from a clear idea that being too defensive and possessive about theories and fighting each other too much is not really productive. And we need to, at contrary, like being widely informed of all the theories out there and trying to have a dialogue, a Socratic dialogue around those different intuition ideas and where the fact stands, where the data stands. And for instance, like there are like adversarial collaboration that have been started on consciousness for that. But it's very a beginning. Like I know how people have been controversially reacting to that because it's new and people don't like change. But feel like that's a way forward, like to have a more like collective and cooperative way of progressing. And that means like being able to disagree also, not meaning like having necessarily all the same ideas, but being respectful of ideas that you don't agree with and trying to understand maybe why people think so instead of seeing only the endpoint. I mean, like academia is already like so hard. Like I feel like people are increasing the difficulty of being a scientist by making it also very about egos and fight and stuff. While we are so lucky to have the ability to work on those topics, and if we are respecting each other, like I think only a good thing can come out of it.
For someone who might be interested in going into the field of neuroscience, what would you tell a young future scientist who feels drawn to these questions?
Well, I don't know if it's old school, but I would say like read books. In a sense that to me that was like the thing that brought me there. Like definitely it's by reading books about it. And I feel like if you are going to invest so much amount of your time and energy and your life into a topic, investing hours before reading books about the topic and checking that you are still so excited and enthusiastic about it at the end of the book is a good sanity check, because I can see a lot of people who are superficially enthusiastic, but when you need to actually do the work, it can be like long before you get a reward. And so it's a long game. It's not like a short-term thing. And if you don't have the stamina and the motivation to read a book on the topic, it's already a good sanity check that maybe it's not for you. Well, if it's for you, there are like so many books that are so fascinating that have been written on those questions. So that's a way also to enter what I was talking about, like this empathy for other perspective. Like when you read a book, you're really trying to step in the shoe of the other. And I like as much reading books of people I disagree with than people I agree with, because even understanding why people think they think that is super valuable scientifically. And you can learn a lot from that. Yeah.
Are there any books you would recommend as a starting point or personal favorites of yours?
Well, I mean, like, for instance, the book that convinced me was Invitation to Cognitive Science by Francisco Varela. It's a small one. It's very nice. Even if it's old, it's still, like, I think, sufficiently controversial to be relevant today in questioning the naive computationalism and the brain as a computer metaphor already at that time. But I would say, like, for instance, The Rhythm of the Brain from Busaki is also an extremely important book. Dynamics Patterns from Scott Kelso on self-organization dynamics is, to me, was very important. Recently, I really like the Brain Abstract from Trimuta, which is very nice. There's also the Blind Spot by Evan Thompson and colleagues on how subjectivity is actually one of the blind spots of science. No, there are so many. I'm reading a lot of books, and I not get tired of them. Like, they are really amazing. Recently, I was reading the Sean Carroll Something Deeply Hidden, more like about quantum mechanics. And that's the thing also, like, it's not necessarily only reading books about neuroscience. There are, like, taking from other fields is also super important. Like, one book that definitely was inspiring during my PhD and the later years was Sync by Steve Strogatz, which is really about synchronization. It's an amazing book, very inspiring. Linked by Barabasi on graph theory also was very inspiring. Yeah, What is Life? Schrodinger. There are, like, the list is endless. Like, there are so many books out there and so few time to read them all. But
In closing, if viewers were to take away a few key ideas from your work, what would you most want them to understand?
to me, that would be like that sociality is more constitutive than just a task that cognitive systems do. So, like, we need to take into account social cognition and social interaction more seriously than just something that after you learn or did your system, it can do that after. So that would be one. The other would be like that as human, we are, like, really at this interface between the biological immanence and substrate and these more, like, transcendent cultural social dynamics. And to me, like, heading towards one or the other only is misleading, because we are both simultaneously. And in both cases, that involve also understanding of causality between scales. So, like, how the substrate is connected to our functioning, and how the social dynamics also have downward causal action on what we are. So that's the second thing. And I guess the third one would be like, be gentle. Like, academia is long and very hard past sometimes, but if we are like being gentle with others, curious mind is maybe super important to maintain that. And ultimately, I think that's more like the people you are working with and doing all those work that count more than the discovery themselves. Like the path is made by walking, and the path is the most important part of the thing. Yeah. I mean, like Louis Pasteur was saying, like luck or chance smile to prepared mind. And in a sense, like we are living in a world where like the culture of short-term reward is very pregnant, very present all the time. But good science takes time, and sometimes, like even if it's appear as a serendipitous coincidence, it's because the person have failed so many times or worked so much time on one topic that it can leverage this coincidence or this thing. It could have been missed by someone that would not have been prepared. And so instead of focusing on just the eureka moment, I think like the process itself is extremely important to value. And that's where like being gentle with others and being supportive of others is so important, and not focus only on the celebration of the endpoint only.
Hopefully, we'll have you back at some point to discuss some of your upcoming publications and the work you are continuing to do. I really appreciate your time, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And of course, like pleasure to be there back sooner or later.